Doki Doki Literature Club, a visual novel game set in a Japanese high school, traces its origins back to early 2015. Dan Salvato, who was going to college at that time, had been working on his first visual novel project for a while now. Despite multiple script rewrites, Dan believed in the core idea's potential. During this period, he came up with a radically different visual novel concept. He shared this new idea with his friend Corey, and painted a picture of a game that initially embraces all the typical romance tropes, only to subvert them with a twist that results in things being off. The game would gradually unravel, marked by eerie glitches and unsettling character behaviors, culminating in the revelation of an insidious character pulling the strings behind the scenes. Corey was captivated by the concept and encouraged Dan to pursue it. However, Dan's ongoing project already consumed all of his spare time. Nevertheless, Corey's enthusiastic response ensured that the idea for what would ultimately become Doki Doki Literature Club lingered in the back of Dan's mind. Fast forward a year and Dan was still working on his initial visual novel project with the help of his friend Masha. By chance, Dan one day mentioned his parody horror game concept in conversation, and to put it lightly, she was enthusiastic. Both shared a vision for a more daring visual novel industry, one that wouldn't lean heavily on repetitive tropes. The idea of creating a game that poked fun at these conventions was naturally appealing to them. Moreover, this new concept was more bite-sized and focused compared to Dan's ongoing project. After giving it some thought, Dan concluded that starting with a shorter project would be the smarter move. It would allow him to gain experience quicker and use that experience to continue making better and more complex visual novels moving forward. Dan, born in 1991, underwent a significant personal transformation from his time as a kid to the person he is today. I was lonely, self-centered, arrogant, and didn't understand how to truly consider the feelings of others around me. I finally started to turn around a bit my senior year, but it took me a good few years after that to just chill out and learn to respect and appreciate everyone. I am extremely glad those years are so far behind me now. Growing up, Dan watched a lot of anime, with a particular fondness for slice-of-life anime. K-On! Stands out as one of his favorites. His journey into visual novels began in college, starting with Tsukihime, which left a lasting emotional impact on him. He was still contemplating the experience a week later, because he felt deeply connected to the story and how he was able to influence it as a player. Dan was hooked on visual novels from that point forward. Before the creation of Doki Doki Literature Club, Dan had already accomplished a lot in the gaming world. He was a professional Super Smash Bros. Player, renowned at one point as one of the top Melee Link players in the United States. Dan also contributed to the development of popular mods for both Melee and Brawl. Beyond his gaming skills, he is the creator of Franker Phase Z, a widely used Twitch extension that offers custom channel emotes, layout and chat customization, advanced moderation tools, and more. In 2015, he gained further recognition for designing notoriously challenging Super Mario Maker levels, such as P is for Pain. It was around this time that Dan conceived the idea for Doki Doki Literature Club. If you, just like Dan, want to make games or develop other types of digital experiences, I highly recommend checking out boot.dev, which is this video's sponsor. Boot.dev is an online platform that has turned learning how to code into a fun and captivating RPG experience. They provide courses for the programming language Python and Go, so you can learn back-end web development from start to finish. Creating your own visual novel game will be within reach as well, since Doki Doki Literature Club was also made using Python. The platform is designed to make sure you'll be writing a ton of code, as the people at boot.dev believe the best way to learn to program is by getting your hands on the keyboard and completing projects. All the while, you'll be earning XP, levels, and achievements by completing quests. Not everyone has the means to pay for a membership, so all of their content is free to read and watch in guest mode. A paid membership unlocks the game and all the interactive components that go with it, the whole reason why boot.dev is so engaging and efficient at teaching you how to code. Click the link in the description box and use my code ThatGuyGlen to get 25% off your first payment for boot.dev. That's 25% off your first month or your first year, depending on the subscription you choose. Boot.dev, learn back-end web development the smart way. Now back to the video. During the course of development, Dan was inspired by a self-described love-hate relationship with anime. His mixed feelings about the cute girls doing cute things trope, which he views as both a strength and weakness in anime, significantly shaped his ideas for the game. His inclination towards horror was fueled by a wide range of emotional experiences he had with video games and technology that he describes as surreal or unsettling, or things that kind of get under your skin. Things that are scary because they make you uncomfortable, not because they shove scary looking things in your face. In an interview with Kotaku, Dan mentioned that Yuminiki, Eversion, and Irisu Syndrome are particularly successful at creating that type of atmosphere and served as a major influence. Creating quote-unquote disturbing content is a reoccurring theme for Dan, as he previously wrote a horror short story about a 19-year-old girl who commits a random act of murder, which was published on the website Thought Catalog. Other, more amusing influences came from childhood memories of feeling creeped out when the CD tray opened automatically when traversing between islands in the game Riven, and the disturbing grinding noise Dan's Amiga disk drive would make whenever there was a disk read error. In addition to crafting an unsettling atmosphere, Dan aimed to tell a story that could only be realized within the video game medium. He has always been drawn to games that offer such unique experiences, and his most memorable moments in gaming have come from titles that utilize storytelling techniques exclusive to the medium. He regards games like Riven, Portal, Braid, and Yuminiki as masterpieces because they fully harness the interactive nature of video games. These titles, among others, represent for Dan the epitome of what sets video games apart from other forms of media, making them truly special and exceptional. In Dan's view, these games immerse the player so deeply in the story that they become a fundamental part of the narrative, actively shaping and unraveling it, rather than merely controlling a character and letting the story wash over them. Dan likes to say that fiction is communication. His whole life, whenever he had a profoundly emotional experience, his immediate desire was to share those same feelings and insights with others. He found that fiction seems to have this magical power of doing exactly that, transferring emotions and experiences from the creator to the audience, while also capturing the essence of those moments. This transformative power of storytelling is precisely why Dan is passionate about crafting fictional stories. Given Dan's extensive experience with anime and visual novels, as well as his insights into Western anime culture, it didn't take long to come up with a bunch of generic anime character tropes. However, refining them in writing proved challenging. The goal was to give nods to visual novel games that are genuinely badly written, while also preserving some level of authenticity that will make the game and its characters enjoyable. As mentioned earlier, Dan aimed to blend a fairly simple story that parodies visual novels with surreal horror elements. He intended for the satirical nature of the game to prevent players from taking it too seriously, setting the stage to then use that mindset against them by forcing them to rethink their relationship with fiction. He saw it as an opportunity to tackle some darker subjects, giving the story a more nihilistic vibe. During an interview, Dan clarified that nihilism, in his view, doesn't mean hopelessness. Rather, it means that you can forge your own path in life and focus on aspects within your control. Dan values that sort of feeling more than a generic happy ending with complete closure, and further said it might inspire the player to strive toward being a better person, doing the small things they know are in their power to make a difference. People become disturbed when forced to think about things they don't want to, or shown a reality that they always try to ignore. But humans aren't rational creatures. It's when we're emotionally charged that we become inspired to do something for ourselves or for others. Dan initially envisioned the characters with generic cookie-cutter personalities. However, as he delved into the writing process, he felt an unexpected urge to connect with them on a deeper level. Consequently, the characters began to reveal insecurities and realistic personality traits beneath their surface archetypes. At that point, he decided to lean into that direction wholeheartedly and gave them relatable human traits based on his own experiences and observations in life, complete with flaws and internal struggles. A prime example is Sayori, a character whose depiction of depression is influenced by people close to Dan who suffer from depression. Dan realized the importance of enabling players to empathize with the characters, rooting for their triumph in the face of adversity. Even if the players do not directly identify with the characters, they might see reflections of acquaintances, friends, or colleagues in their defensive behaviors or shared insecurities. Spending time with these characters in the game, understanding their thoughts and emotions, could offer players valuable insights into the experiences of others in real life, extending beyond their personal perspectives. Dan also recognized that individuals, especially those who are neurodivergent, often relate with the internal struggle, that our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors don't always align with the person we truly want to be. People tend to feel that strongly in fictional characters and therefore don't want to fault them for their flaws and mistakes. That said, Dan has also seen how mental health issues can be mishandled in stories when they are detached from characters, becoming mere plot devices. This approach risks reducing complex individuals to simplistic problem-creating stereotypes. Doki Doki Literature Club addresses and criticizes that tendency through its own story. The scriptwriting process was a very non-linear process. While Dan had planned out the main story beats in advance, the bulk of the script evolved alongside the game's development, as the two were intrinsically linked in multiple ways. As a result, Dan was making changes to the script up until right before the game's release. Fun fact, all the dialogue and text was intentionally written to sound like a translated Japanese visual novel, rather than something that was originally written in English. To add to the game's parody, Dan chose generic-sounding Japanese names for the main characters, poking fun at Western visual novels set in a pseudo-Japan. This term refers to settings that, while inspired by Japan and seemingly located there, lack full cultural accuracy due to the writer possibly not knowing quite enough about Japan. Natsuki represents the fiery and assertive archetype, whereas Yuri is characterized as quiet and elegant. Sayuri is a fusion of Sayuri and Sori. Finally, Monica completes the satire by literally taking an English name and throwing a K in there to match Romanized Japanese. The choice of Monica, resembling a stereotypically popular girl's name, also serves as a subtle indication that she is out of place in the game's setting, unlike the other characters. For the game's engine, Dan went with RenPy, a Python-based open-source engine specifically tailored for visual novel game development. Fans of the genre may recognize that the engine's name, RenPy, is a portmanteau or blend word of Renai, the Japanese term for romantic love, and Python, the programming language the engine runs on. Access to the source code enabled Dan to manipulate the engine beyond its intended capabilities, as a philosophy of the engine's developers was to prioritize player control. However, Dan's vision for the game deviated greatly from this philosophy, so he modified the engine using his own Python code. Dan, acknowledging his limitations as an artist, initially used placeholder art from a free online anime character creator tool to develop early prototypes. These temporary assets were invaluable in the initial development phase, but Dan knew he had to eventually find a real artist in order to pull off his concept. Fortunately, one of Dan's college friends, Dave, was an artist. After being briefed on the concept and impressed by the progress made on the game's story, logo, and theme song, Dave grabbed his tablet and started sketching. They started off by designing the school uniform. In the blink of an eye, Dave produced a whole row of concept art. The design on the far right, after a minor adjustment from a green to a blue skirt, was chosen as the game's signature outfit. With the uniform more or less in place, it was time to design the characters. Dave first made some rough sketches of the whole cast. Since Dan initially didn't provide any reference for character height, Dave drew them all at the same height. At this stage, Yuri and Monika's designs were already pretty spot on, but Sayori and Natsuki needed some adjustments in proportions, hairstyles, and other details. Dan had been leaning towards giving Sayori short hair, and seeing a range of options helped confirm his choice. Fans have probably already noticed the different art style used in the concept art, and that's because Dave was always more inspired by anime styles from the 90s and early 2000s. Once Dave had laid the groundwork for the character's overall design, another artist named Kagefumi came aboard to further set the designs in stone. Character heights were still under consideration, which is why Natsuki appears taller in Kagefumi's concept art. Dan wanted one of the characters to wear higher stockings, and originally thought Yuri might be a good fit. However, after pinning down each character's personality more, Dan decided Yuri isn't the type to draw attention to herself. Instead, they gave the higher stockings to Monika, who is the confident one of the group and cares more about her impression. Kagefumi was initially going to illustrate the entire game, but unrelated personal difficulties resulted in her having to step down after a few months. Dan then found a freelance artist known as Satchley and asked her to help continue the work that Kagufumi had started. She agreed, and once she officially came on board, the development of the in-game sprites accelerated. Satchley's first task was to sketch all the sprite poses, enabling Dan to replace the in-game placeholders with artwork that was closer to the final design. As evident from this early screenshot, the user interface still required refinement at this stage of development. However, prioritizing the UI wasn't deemed necessary at the time, given the substantial amount of work left on the script and scene construction. Dan had specific requirements for the character pose system. The plan was to assign each character 3 poses: a basic stance, an alternate arm stance, and an action pose. The alternate arms could be combined with the basic stance in any combination, resulting in 4 unique poses. Additionally, the action pose was designed to be a special, standalone stance that would capture the character's expressiveness. Integrating this system into the game proved to be quite challenging. A lot of extremely careful image editing produced character halves that Dan could then programmatically stitch together in the game itself. This approach allowed the use of a limited number of source images to generate a wide variety of character sprites. Initially, this method was quite efficient. However, the complexity increased when they started to mix in different facial expressions. Here you can see an example of a cheat sheet that Dan used during scene construction. Each facial expression is assigned a letter for convenient referencing. Including the Y expression, which isn't shown on this sheet, Sayori has 25 different facial expressions. When combined with the arm poses, there are a total of 100 sprite combinations. Natsuki is a sole exception, as she has 2 different head orientations, front and turned. Her front-facing head works with both her basic pose and her action pose, resulting in 155 possible combinations. Knowing this, it's understandable why Dan opted for a more dynamic pose system instead of drawing full sprites. Not only would it take up a ton of space in terms of data, but it would also turn making small adjustments to poses or facial expressions into a painstaking process. Ultimately, the pose system proved to be highly efficient, saving Dan considerable time and resources. Designing the backgrounds was a relatively straightforward process. Freelance illustrator Valinquin joined the project to craft every background image. Dan provided him with a lot of reference images, and Valinquin's talent took care of the rest. He would start out by creating a 3D model of the scene, followed by sharing temporary renders with Dan until they settled on the best camera angle. Afterwards, Valinquin would import a chosen render into Photoshop and paint over it to achieve the illustrated look you see in-game. Displayed here is an early rendition of the club room, which couldn't be used because the scene wasn't well lit enough. Dan composed the game's soundtrack himself, leveraging his long-standing hobby in music composition. He describes the soundtrack as extremely simple, but even so, he barely managed to get by with his skills. His decision to handle the composition himself came from a desire to infuse the game with simple catchy melodies and recurring motifs, elements he refers to as having a quote-unquote high hummable factor. Dan drew inspiration from anime music and the soundtracks of various Nintendo games, including Yoshi's Story and Animal Crossing, known for their memorable melodies. The main theme is primarily performed by piano and flute, with string instruments providing accompaniment. Notably, the track OK Everyone comes in 5 different versions. 4 of these versions are characterized by distinct musical instruments that symbolize each of the 4 characters. Monika's version is distinguished by piano highlights. Yuri's version incorporates pizzicato strings and harp. Natsuki's rendition is brought to life with xylophone and recorder, and Sayori's interpretation is conveyed through the ukulele. Doki Doki Literature Club was launched in September 2017, just a week after its official announcement. Dan decided to release it on itch.io using a pay-what-you-want model, as well as on Steam, where users could download it for free or pay $10 to unlock the fan pack. With virtually no marketing budget, Dan primarily relied on word of mouth to promote the game. Fortunately, Dan had already established a following on the internet due to his involvement in the Smash and Mario Maker communities, which greatly helped to spread initial awareness. Moreover, he was friends with several Twitch streamers who played the game upon its release. The game also received numerous positive reviews on Steam, which helped it gain further momentum. Established YouTubers began playing it and sharing their experiences, further amplifying its reach. Major gaming websites took notice as well. For instance, PC Gamer hailed it as one of the most surprising games of the year. After only about 2 months, the game had already surpassed 2 million downloads, making a significant impact in both the visual novel and horror genres. This success extended into the award season of that year. At the IGN's Best of 2017 awards, Doki Doki Literature Club garnered the People's Choice Award in several categories: Best PC Game, Best Adventure Game, Best Story, and Most Innovative. Additionally, IGN ranked it as the 12th scariest game of its generation. The game also won the Matthew Crumb Cultural Innovation Award at the South by Southwest Gaming Awards, further solidifying its status in the gaming community. Given Dan usually has a pretty good understanding of the audience he designs things for, he recognized the game's potential to appeal not only to fans of visual novels, but also to attract players from outside the genre. He suspected that players would go into it thinking that they don't have to take the visual novel component seriously, like Hatoful Boyfriend for instance, making it feel very low commitment and approachable. However, he never anticipated the overwhelming popularity and heartwarming reception it received. Dan was especially nervous about how the audience would respond to the game's exploration of heavy themes, such as depression and suicide, fearing it might be dismissed as unnecessary cruelty. To his relief, people started messaging him, sharing how the game helped them process their own struggles with depression and the pain of losing loved ones to suicide. Another incredible moment for Dan came after the game's release, when he received an email from Jason Hayes, the composer for World of Warcraft. Jason reached out just to express his appreciation for Doki Doki Literature Club. Dan was astonished that his game had reached someone like Jason, who operates in a completely different sphere within the games industry, far removed from Dan's indie circle. However, what was undoubtedly the best moment of Dan's career at that time was his first convention appearance to discuss Doki Doki Literature Club. Some people in line started singing the lyrics from the game's end credits soundtrack, and Dan found himself fighting back tears in that moment. As previously mentioned, Dan's ultimate ambition was to convey his personal experiences and emotions through fiction. Therefore, receiving indications that he not only achieved this goal, but also exceeded it, represents the highest praise he could receive. While the widespread popularity and recognition of the game were incredibly exciting for Dan, it also worried him. Although seeing the DLC become popular was incredibly exciting for me, it also brought about this sense of regret that my future, larger projects will simply not match the popularity of this one. But I'm okay with that. I'm very deliberate on the audiences that I target with my projects, and the DLC happened to aim for a large audience. On the other hand, his life completely changed very quickly. He went from being a tinkerer that spent most of his time in solitude to being a public face of an enormously popular brand overnight. Unfortunately, it had a negative impact on his mental health, and Dan has shared that the period between 2018 and 2019 was the most difficult time of his life. Suddenly, he had to worry about business responsibilities, partnerships, merchandise, and legal stuff. Working with a diverse group of people on various projects required responsibilities and skills he had yet to develop, leaving him unprepared. Despite this, he also felt he couldn't turn any of those things down, as it seemed like huge opportunities. While Dan worked with freelance artists during the game's development, it's important to note that he was still a one-man team at this point in his career. Therefore, he felt like all eyes were on him, causing immense pressure and left him feeling miserable in the end. He simply couldn't do everything that was expected of him. Worst of all, it consumed so much of his time that he couldn't pursue other game projects. Understandably, this period was incredibly overwhelming and challenging. However, it allowed Dan to get a much better understanding of himself, the meaning of success, and what he needed in order to be happy. Dan decided to assemble a small team to continue developing visual novel games. Back in 2019, Dan shared with IGN his desire to expand on his beloved Literature Club characters, possibly in the form of DLC. Furthermore, he mentioned plans of being in the middle of developing an entirely new visual novel IP. In June 2021, Dan Salvato officially revealed a premium edition of their debut game, titled Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. This version promised additional story content, visual enhancements, and extra music tracks, and it was also planned to be released for consoles. Interestingly, Dan had considered porting the original game to consoles immediately after its release, but he simply couldn't imagine charging for a game that was available for free on PC. Therefore, he and the rest of the team put so much thought and care into an upgraded version that would be worthy of people's money. They believed $15 was a reasonable price that would keep the entry barrier low, allowing a broader audience to enjoy the game. In an interview with Nintendo Everything, Dan revealed his motivation for returning to Literature Club was to be able to delve deeper into its themes. He pointed out that the game centers around the characters' very real and relatable insecurities and personal struggles, with which many players strongly identify. Dan aimed to create additional story content to allow the characters to explore their interpersonal relationships more deeply than the original game allowed. After receiving feedback from hundreds of fans about their deep connections with each character, viewing them almost as friends, Dan recognized both the value and significance of his creation, as well as the responsibility to remain faithful to the characters while developing additional content. Another fun fact, in the key art for the Plus edition, each club member appears slightly older and more mature. This artistic choice was made because the team believed the characters had evolved beyond the one-dimensional tropes that drove the original artwork. From a technical standpoint, the game essentially had to be recreated from the ground up. Originally developed for a 720p resolution, the transition to consoles, typically connected to TVs, necessitated an upgrade to full 1080p resolution. This was a significant challenge for a small team, requiring them to revisit the source materials and produce 1080p versions of all the artwork. Dan mentioned that some bits and pieces even had to be completely redrawn, which was a very meticulous and painstaking process. Fortunately, Dan Salvato received technical support from publisher Serenity Forge and their in-house development team. The collaboration with Serenity Forge was chosen due to their intimate understanding of the nuance involved in working on Doki Doki Literature Club, from the game design, marketing, all the way to the physical packaging. Dan believes that many larger publishers might have halted progress in reaction to some of the team's more wild ideas, whereas Serenity Forge embraced them. Only a few weeks after its official reveal, the Plus edition was released across all available platforms, and unsurprisingly, it once again received widespread acclaim from both critics and gamers alike. As of February 2023, Doki Doki Literature Club has been downloaded more than 13 million times, while the Plus edition has sold over 1 million copies. Dan has received a lot of requests about the potential of adapting Doki Doki Literature Club to other formats, such as manga. However, such a move would contradict everything that Dan is deeply passionate about. The DLC was literally created under the premise that video games and interactive media are what enable the story to be told. That's what I feel most passionate about, I think. The utilization of this specific yet magical art form to tell stories that otherwise can't be told. It would be cheap and disappointing to try and take the DDLC story and gameplay experience as it exists and plop it into some other form of media that wouldn't work. Regarding the future of Doki Doki Literature Club and Team Salvato, there are currently no plans for new content for Literature Club. However, Dan is open to the possibility of creating something new if he comes across an idea he truly believes in. As of this video's release, the Team Salvato website lists 3 projects in development: an unnamed visual novel, a game designed for the old-school Amiga home computer titled Magicore Anomala, and a third project that remains shrouded in mystery. From its humble beginnings in 2015 to its release on consoles like the Nintendo Switch, Dan sometimes still can't believe he actually made it. On the one hand, it feels like DDLC has been around for so long at this point, or rather it's been such a huge part of my life that it almost feels like just some entity out there. So sometimes when I sit down and remind myself of what this is, the fact that I made it and it has this visibility, like Nintendo for example tweeting about it, once I sit down with a moment of mindfulness, that's when I really feel the emotion surrounding it. And I can tell myself how amazing it is that I've made it to this point. I've never wanted to find an I've made it moment, because that's so dependent on everyone's individual definition for success. What matters to me are the personal experiences that have meaning to me, and being a lifelong Nintendo fan and seeing my game get that sort of recognition was easily one of the most meaningful things to happen so far in my gaming career.